Okay, we'll jump in, and if more folks join while we're going, then that's great. The first part's going to be kind of an intro, so it'll be good if folks, yeah, I can see more screens popping up as we go. So I'll start by saying, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Torrance. I'm the campaign director at the Wilderness Committee. It's great to see all of you this morning. I'm calling in from our office on the unceded Lekwungen territories of the Esquimalt and the Songhees Nations. And I think when we're, having any conversation about old growth or environmental policy or resources, we need to acknowledge the territories that we're on. And in the case of forests, that all forests in a place like BC grow on the territories of an Indigenous nation, and solutions in these forests need to need to include justice for those peoples, the return of sovereignty and the return of land to those Indigenous nations. So if we can kind of keep that in mind moving forward today and in this work, that's a really important piece to start with. So today, this webinar, I'll give you a rundown of the agenda. We're going to start with sort of a basic review of where things are at in BC right now. I'm assuming that for most folks on this webinar, you'll have a good idea. You follow this issue pretty closely. Someone just said they can't hear me. Sign off and rejoin. Sounds good, Karen. They have a good idea of where you have a good idea of where things are at, but I'll run down kind of a really quick kind of recent timeline. That'll only take a couple minutes. Then I'll talk a little bit about the strategy of why we're working so hard to encourage people to get a meeting with their MLA, kind of why it's important, why right now. I'll talk for a few minutes about the goals and how to kind of manage depending on your MLA, which party they're from, what part of the province they're in. Then we'll talk about the how, the specific ins and outs of a request, as well as the tech on our end. I'll share my screen at that point and kind of do a walkthrough. And I'm hoping to wrap this up in about 30 minutes, so you don't have to listen to me talk all morning. And then we'll do a question and answer which my colleague Chloe will facilitate. So I forgot to say off the bat, we are recording this webinar, and our hope is to share it later on social media so that more people can follow and learn and get involved. So if you're not comfortable being kind of on the recording, turn your camera off. And yeah, when we move to questions and answers, you can either say I have a question in the chat, and then Chloe will call on you, or you can ask your question directly in the chat, at which point Chloe will read it out, and then I'll answer it as best I can. So we'll get started. A rundown of where things are at. Again, I imagine this is sort of familiar for a lot of you, but the current government was first elected into a minority government in 2017, and old growth was one of a whole host of environmental issues that they promised change on. Instead of doing anything right away, they waited 2 years, so 2 years into their mandate, and then announced a review in the spring of 2019. At the time, we were frustrated because, the action is clear. We need a halt to old growth logging so that these trees can still be standing. Any review without immediate action, it's like a fire department reviewing best practices for firefighting while a building's burning. Right? There needs to be interim action to protect the very thing that we're reviewing in the meantime. So that was our reaction to the announcement of the review at the time in summer 2019, spring 2019. We participated in it. I met with the panel with a couple other Wilderness Committee campaigners. We encouraged hundreds of supporters to submit comments and to seek meetings with the panel. And over the next 8 months, the 2-person independent panel that the government appointed to conduct the review did the most extensive review of forest policy that's been done in BC. They handed the report to Premier Horgan and the cabinet a little over a year ago on April 30th, 2020. And the report itself has the potential to be transformative. It calls the status quo unsustainable. It says the current management regime prioritizes timber harvesting over all other forest values. And it calls for a paradigm shift to change that. That is what the Wilderness Committee, the environmental movement, many of you have been saying for decades. And to see that repeated by this expert panel was encouraging. They also included specific recommendations for government to honor their recommendations, or to honor the spirit of the report and implement it. The initial response by government, again, was encouraging. They announced some first step measures, and just weeks later, they released the report publicly in last fall. And just weeks after releasing it, they promised to implement the recommendations in totality and protect old growth forest in BC. Then the problem started to emerge. So upon deeper review, the first round of deferrals, which were kind of the marquee interim initial action to the report, highlighted a ton of shortcomings with these deferrals. So namely the amount of high productivity old growth, so the old growth with the biggest trees, the most biodiversity, it is actually very low within only a couple thousand hectares within the 350,000 hectares of area deferred. A huge chunk of the deferral areas are second growth forests, which there's nothing wrong with setting second growth aside along with old growth, but that's not what government did. Logging is still permitted in the second growth forest within the deferral areas. And then since then, it's now been more than 6 months since the report was released. It's been more than a year since the report was received by government, and there hasn't been a second step. They pitched their initial measures as a first step, and there hasn't been any follow-up, which is incredibly frustrating. And the problem is the forests are falling. The panel included specific 6-month timelines to accomplish its recommendation around setting aside the most at-risk forest, because they know, like we all know, that that's what industry is targeting. Industry is cutting down the most productive old growth forests with the biggest trees because that's what's most profitable for them. That's why the panel called for them to be deferred within 6 months, and that's why it's so frustrating that government hasn't. These forests won't be around in another 3 or 4 years after government's done talking about it. In fact, Horgan stood on the debate stage in the election last fall and said the most valuable forests are worth more standing. The forests most worthy of that statement when he said it are gone. They have been logged in the last 6 months since the election. This is just too live an issue to say, oh yes, we're going to change. And in fact, promising to save old growth, promising to implement a paradigm shift, and then not actually changing anything substantial on the ground, it kind of just puts the call out to industry to get it while they can. And that appears to be what's happening. A few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago today, we released some original mapping and that tracks the approved cut blocks over the last 12 months. And we found that there was a 43% increase in approved old growth logging in BC in the 12 months since the panel handed in their report, right? So whether that translates to an increase in logging, I imagine it does, maybe not to the same scale. So as this company's trying to stockpile old growth permits, basically, that will then make it harder and more expensive if government does want to defer logging. And how much of a spike in logging are we seeing? There's really high lumber prices that could be impacting it. But this is, again, talk and log isn't a new term, but the government has certainly been, that's a certainly an apt summary of the government's approach over the last year. So there's a lot going on right now. You know, the public is frustrated about this. The power of social media and other platforms to bring what's happening out in the woods to people. Lots of you get out into the woods yourselves. And the reason this falls so flat is because people know what's happening. Just today, this morning, the RCMP announced that they're going to begin enforcement at blockades at Fairy Creek and the Kaikous Valley and other locations on southwestern Vancouver Island. And it shouldn't have to be here, right? It shouldn't have to be at this stage. There's also been rallies and demonstrations across the province, you know, as they can be held, very small, very distanced in this COVID context. And a huge piece that we're encouraging is for people to engage directly with decision makers. So we've done phone blitzes over the last couple months and weeks that have mobilized hundreds or thousands of phone calls to MLAs and the premiers and the ministers' offices. And a big one right now is to get people to meet with their MLAs. And that's what we're here to chat about today. So this is just one kind of tactic to keep the pressure up on this. I encourage everyone to learn about other ways and other methods to get involved and do as much as you can, because it is an all hands on deck moment. But meeting with MLAs is extremely effective, and it's something that we can do from home now with the power of Zoom. We don't have to go into our MLAs offices and meet with them, which of course isn't allowed right now. So this is a way to move the needle, or at least increase pressure on MLAs. We know that the BC government is feeling the pressure on this. You can hear it in the Premier's tone and the Forest Minister's tone. They know this is a big issue, and they you know, have some desire to make it go away. And again, we know specific MLAs are. So we've heard people who have achieved meetings or have sought meetings with their MLAs, and we know that a lot of MLAs are feeling the heat and keeping that up. We want these individuals that, you know, the Premier knows, the Forest Minister knows, these are their colleagues, and we want them going to those in power and saying, hey, you know, my constituents won't stop me asking me for meetings about old growth. So the strategy varies a little bit depending on your MLA, whether they're a government MLA or an opposition MLA. I'll speak to that in a moment. The benefit of going through our system, as opposed to just, you know, looking up your MLA's office and asking them for a meeting, is that it's trackable for us, and we can use that to build the case, you know, based on the total number of meetings, or if a specific MLA says, oh, you know, old growth isn't really a priority, and we can say, well, look, you know, just through our system, 20 of your constituents have asked you for meetings about this, or, you know, the total number overall, we can say 100 people or 500 people or 1,000 people have requested meetings just through our system. It helps highlight that public opposition and make it harder for the government to ignore. So I'll talk a little bit about goals. Again, if I'm going and something's confusing, just, you know, drop a question in the chat, or just say I have a question, and we'll call on you when we get to questions and answers. I'm moving quite quickly through this because I want to get to questions and discussion with all of you at the end here. So I'll talk a bit about the goals for this meeting. So there's a few different kind of categories of MLA. Very generally, there's I guess like a friendly government MLA. So a member of the NDP who has spoken supportively of protecting old growth in the past. Lots were lions on this before they got elected, and then curiously have been a lot quieter on it since they've been MLAs. You know, some we're hearing are more concerned about this than others, and for those, we want to be meeting with those MLAs and calling on them to champion this. Calling on them to say, hey, look, you know, this issue needs a really strong voice in caucus, and that can be you. How can we support you in that? And what do you need kind of publicly so that you can go to caucus meetings or cabinet meetings if they're in cabinet, or just ask the forest minister or the premier to have a conversation with them about how they can move faster. A huge piece is on information. So a lot of the communications on old growth is done centrally from the Ministry of Forests, from the Minister of Forests office. And a lot of the information that the MLAs get is just the information that's put out publicly, and it's not right. You know, so we've been you know, updated from supporters who have got these meetings that their MLA says, oh, you know, I care about old growth. That's why I was so glad we protected 350,000 hectares. And then the people have said, well, actually, like, look, only this much is really productive old growth. This much is kind of marginal old growth. This much was already protected. This much is second growth that's still being logged. And the MLAs don't know that, right? So catching MLAs up, bringing them up to speed on this, that's a huge piece if you think your MLA is on side with this and could potentially be a champion on this. The other side of that is ones that aren't. So government MLAs, NDP MLAs that, you know, their attitude is just kind of, look, we're moving on this, it's enough, we don't need to go any faster, we can't go any faster, it's too bad for industry, we have to care about jobs, not just trees. And for this, the strategy is to hold them accountable, is to say, we're watching you, I'm a constituent, I don't agree with your position, and this isn't fair. You know, the very act of requesting the meeting, that's the real kind of tactic here. I don't think any of us are going to meet with our MLAs and completely change their mind on old growth in one meeting, right? We can share some information that maybe they didn't know, but the point is to take up their time, take up their office's time, and make this an issue that's harder for them to ignore. Make it one that when caucus meets and people say, what are your constituents concerned about, one of the things they say is old growth. So that's the case of an MLA that you don't think is on side with this. The third category would be ones who you're not sure. Right, so there's a lot of MLAs in government. Yeah, a lot of them are new, and a lot of them don't have clearly defined positions on this. Most politicians keep their cards pretty close to their chest on a lot of things. So again, you know, I would call on them. I would say, look, this is a huge issue. We need champions within government, and I'm calling on you as my MLA to be that champion. That's a powerful role that you can play at this time, and then kind of go from there in the process of both requesting the meeting and then if you land the meeting. And then the fourth category, 30 ridings in BC are represented by MLAs who aren't in government. So they're either from the Liberal Party or the Green Party. On this, I would go case by case. You know, if it's an MLA that you think, you know, is pro old growth logging, or you know, when the Liberal Party was in power, they didn't do anything really on old growth. A lot of the MLAs from the Liberal Party are again staunchly pro old growth logging. So if you don't think there's much point, then don't request one. But if you think that, you know, holding them accountable, again, you know, the more, from my perspective, the Wilderness Committee's perspective, the more requests to meet from members of any party, the better, right? Because we can say, look, we have this many people who have requested meetings just through our system. You know, when opposition parties or at least the Liberal Party stands up and says, hey, you know, we're hearing that we need to keep logging old growth and protect the forest industry, we could say, hey, actually, you know, we have in our system request to your office to meet with you about protecting old growth, right? So that's a huge way that a huge way that we can create that accountability piece. The two ridings that are represented by the Green Party, the Green Party is very vocal on this. They're calling for the report's recommendations to be implemented. They're calling for old growth to be protected. Whether you want to meet with them or not, it's always up to you. You could email their office instead and say, hey, how can I help on this? How can I help, you know, raise the temperature? How can I help raise awareness? You know, that's an option for those of you that live in the Cowichan Valley or Saanich in the islands. And then the other option is asking for a meeting with the closest government MLA to you. You know, this is a little bit, MLAs are only bound to meet with their own constituents, but, you know, in past like phone blitzes on, say, a federal issue, like a pipeline issue, where there's been a phone blitz to call a government MP's office. I live on Vancouver Island. There are no government MP's offices. There aren't even official opposition offices on Vancouver Island, right? So the closest Liberal Party, federal Liberal Party offices to me are in Vancouver. And I've called them and said, hey, you know, I want to call on this MP to cancel Trans Mountain or whatever the issue is. And they say, do you live in the riding? And I say, no, I live on Vancouver Island. This is the closest government riding to me. So you can try that too, and probably depend on the constituency office staff and certainly on the MLA whether they would entertain the idea of a meeting with you, but that's a route that you can go as well. So yeah, I mean, on that, I'm going to shift now and talk about the how piece for the last few minutes here before we get into questions and discussion. And I guess I'll lead this section by saying, you know, the people that you're going to be interacting with, emails to constituency offices don't go to the MLA. You probably know this. They go to a staff, right? And, you know, I think it's important that, you know, in this kind of era of really charged and emotional attachment to these issues that we all have, that we, you know, try to, it can be hard sometimes, but try to channel that frustration to the issue and not to the people. You know, if you do start having a back and forth with a constituency assistant, be polite. You know, they're a person, lots of them we know don't agree with the government's position on old growth. They're working in their MLA's office because they see it as a way to serve their community. So keep that in mind when having these conversations with your MLA's staff. In that, when you're setting up your request for a meeting, think about the messaging and the framing. MLAs will argue that they're busy. They do have some responsibility to meet with constituents about issues that they care about. So think if you were in your MLA's position and you were reviewing, or you were having your staff review a request for a meeting, what would make you kind of feel more motivated, right? A huge thing that people have been having success with is forming delegations. So rather than just, you know, hey, I'm John, I live in your riding, please meet with me about old growth, get together a handful of your neighbors, your friends, and say, look, you know, there's 4 or 5 of us and we're concerned about old growth. Will you meet with us? So that's a route that a lot of our supporters have been going and landing meetings with success. You know, if they ask for a name of your group, you can make one up. If you live in Burnaby, you could just call it like Burnaby Citizens for Old Growth, or, you know, South Surrey Old Growth Committee, or whatever it is. But this is a piece, and then just putting it together, why this issue matters to you, why it matters to the riding and the province, and really make that strong argument for them to meet with you. So I'm gonna go through the tech here. And I'm going to share my screen just so you can see what I'm doing and follow along. So you should all be able to see my screen. Hang on, let me center up this tab. I can see you on the side, so I'll just make it a little smaller. All right, so this is our landing page. It's just wildernesscommittee.org/save old growth. And there's all sorts of things here. There's this video of me kind of talking about where things are at last fall in the Kaikous in a recent old growth clear cut. It explains, that our kind of action tools are limited because of the pandemic. And then there's a bunch of different ways. So this is the petition. This is to email your MLA. This is to share the petition. There's some social media tools. There's even a fax option, so we can get old school like it's 1995 and send a fax. But this is the tab. So when you click around, these show you the different options. This one, we have it lit up in red because it's the one that we're pushing the hardest right now. So this is kind of the rationale, and then you just fill out your info. So I'll do this while we're going along. I'll put in all my information, and I'm going to request a meeting with the MLA where our office is here in Victoria. For a couple of reasons. One, because we haven't met with that specific MLA yet. And two, because my MLA at home is the leader of the Green Party. And I've spoken to her about old growth and know where she stands. So I'm gonna, there we go. Rob Fleming is the MLA here. So below is the automatic text, and the goal is that you'll fill this in yourself and change the information, not spell your name wrong.
Torrance?
Yeah.
That's actually not necessary.
Filling this in?
Yeah, it automatically will do it. That's what those tags. So
right.
It's good to know that's what that looks like, but you don't need to customize that if you don't want to.
I'm going to edit this part just because I don't live in Victoria Swan Lake, but I work here. And I'm just going to put that. Based here in, perfect. I would like the opportunity to talk with you. This stuff, is fairly up to date, but again, personal things are powerful here, and putting that in and kind of explaining why this issue means so much to you. If you think that it means a lot to your MLA, you could say that, I know you care, or you've talked about the importance of the natural world or climate change or Indigenous rights. All of that stuff can go here. And then when you're ready, you just hit send. And I don't know why nothing's popping up. Oh, that's why I didn't put a valid email address. There we go. Now it says the address is not. Oh, there we go. So it went through. I should have a pop up in my inbox shortly. Yeah, there it is. An email from myself that says good luck. And I get this one too, so we can track your requests. And you can let us know if you have questions, that sort of thing. But that's the process. Again, whether I'm going to stop sharing my screen, whether you meet with your MLA through our system or just request a meeting on your own, go on their website and request a meeting. Tactically, strategically, there's not a huge difference. The benefit for Wilderness Committee is that we can track it and we can use this in our messaging, right? We can see specific MLAs if they've been asked to meet with constituents about old growth, and we can see the total number. So that's why it's helpful to go through our system, but you don't have to if you don't want to. And then the last thing in terms of how, I've spoken about the framing, I've spoken about the delegation piece, but persistence is key. So we just got a meeting, myself and some other reps from other environmental organizations just got a meeting for next month with the Minister of Forests. And I think we had to ask 3 times, you know, and follow up, explain the importance. So, you know, don't be discouraged. You should get an automatic, like, thank you for contacting so-and-so's office. We'll get back to you shortly. And then one of 2 things will happen after that. You know, either you won't hear back, in which case after a week or maybe 10 days, I would follow up. Or you'll hear back and they'll say, hey, we're really busy, you know, and they'll kind of say, is this really needed? Why do you need to meet? But being persistent, saying this issue is not going to go away, and neither will you. I'm following up and following up and following up. Again, the request for the meeting and the request for your MLA's time on this to bring it to their attention, it's as important as what to say in the meeting. And that's kind of what we really want to stress. In terms of what you say in the meeting, I was, you know, I didn't want to, I think it'll be different depending on each MLA, and this issue is changing so quickly. We are building a kind of guide for that. We were hoping to have it ready for this webinar, but we haven't. There are lots of resources on our website. You know, there's a lot of resources online, but we're putting together something specifically with the MLAs, the kind of classic talking points that we know they're getting, with kind of those points debunked and pushed back on. So that's something that we'll have shortly for folks to use, and we'll probably host it somewhere on this page. If possible, or send it to you maybe after you send your request. You'll get it in your follow-up email. We're still kind of putting together the pieces on that. But that will be ready ideally this week. And again, the key things to stress are that you know, this isn't a static issue. Old growth isn't that junk drawer in your kitchen where, like, you know, it's a problem and it has to be dealt with, but for now you can just keep it clean and keep it closed, and it's not going to get any worse. This problem is getting worse. Old growth is getting scarcer in lieu of more action and more immediate action on the ground. In fact, in the 12 months since the report was handed to government, logging approvals have actually gone up. So I imagine there'll be some questions around specific things to say, and rather than just kind of talk about what I think is important, I'd rather respond to some of those. So I'm going to turn things over to Chloe. I see there's some questions in the chat. And if, again, we are recording this to share with more folks later. So if you want to ask your question on video, that's ideal, but that will be recorded. So just maybe say, I have a question, Chloe will call on you, or just write your question into the chat and Chloe will read it out. So take it away, Chloe.
Cool, thanks. I'm going to pass it over to Marion for your question. Marion has a hand up right now.
Hi, thanks, Chloe. Thanks, Torrance. So, Torrance, good to see you again. Good seeing you. Very active. There's a couple of things I want to say. I have a question, but we have a little bit of experience meeting with MLAs, and I see quite a few questions actually in the chat as to, first of all, who's willing to meet with the West End MLA. Now, I do want to introduce myself. I'm Marion. I'm with 4Kids in North Vancouver. And 4Kids is a Canadian-wide organization. And in BC, we have started an old growth campaign. So if you're looking for like support, I'm very, very happy to help you out. We have a group in Vancouver that could also join with you. Now, our experience has been that indeed MLAs are very ill-informed about this. They just repeating the information they're being sent by the minister. And it's fairly easy to kind of we just kind of point out where the flaws are. But really, the conversation that you want to have is about, well, what are you doing about this? What is the transparency? That's what I'm finding. I'm missing the transparency big time. And what are you doing? So that's the question we found we're coming back with to our MLAs. That's Bowen Ma, Susie Chand, and we also have met with a minority opposition MLA, Karen Kirkpatrick, and we are meeting actually with Nikki Sharma, hoping to meet also with Robinson and Coquitlam. So we're meeting, but what I find striking and interesting, and I wanted to hear what you have to say about that. the First Nations card is being played. It's like the First Nations have issued a statement that they do not want our involvement and interference with it. Now, I believe that it's not that black and white, but I was curious if you have an answer to that.
Yeah, this is a great question, and you know, in a way, the two biggest rationales to foregoing action on old growth are you know, the classic "it hurts jobs," and then increasingly, well, you know, we can't just change policy, you know, on a sheet of paper because these lands belong to Indigenous nations, and that's not right. And on both of these, the NDP can make it with somewhat more credibility than the Liberal government, because of their ties to labor, because of their history of speaking up for workers. You know, that the current government has passed UNDRIP legislation, and they make this argument with some credibility. And again, we are seeing them lean into this, look, you know, we can't just defer old growth logging because the forests aren't ours, they belong to First Nations. On the debate stage in the last election, when asked about old growth, Premier Horgan said every tree in BC grows in the territory of a First Nation. This is a huge departure from past BC governments, because it's the right position and it's the truth. And the standard of, look, we can't either temporarily or permanently stop old growth logging in an area because essentially there isn't First Nations consent. That's a good standard, but it's currently a double standard, because not one single logging plan or permit is held to that same standard. Logging companies are bound to consult, so inform First Nations of their plans, but there's no legal recourse right now for First Nations to say no, and then that to be listened to. It's basically up to whether the companies want to listen or not, and the answer is usually not. So you know, there are some cases, you know, again, in Pacheedaht territory, on southwestern Vancouver Island, where the Band Council and a hereditary chief have said, look, we don't want outside interference here. I think that those pieces are important, and that if there are governments, in First Nations governments, that are pursuing old growth logging, that you know, government has a duty to accommodate that and to respect that. But there's a lot of nations that are on the opposite side, and if government is only listening to the ones that want to continue old growth logging, that's a huge problem. The other really big piece is around revenue sharing. So it's not 1950 anymore. Most logging operations have some form of revenue sharing with First Nations whose territory they're on, whereas a percentage of the logging revenue that the province gains then goes to those nations, right? They often come with stipulations limiting what the nation can do in terms of opposing any logging plan. So if they sign a revenue sharing agreement, they're limited in their capacity to speak out against logging pertaining to that agreement. But the more important piece is that as soon as those agreements are in place, government can't just say, hey, you know, what do you think about deferring or protecting old growth on your territory, without money also being brought to the table. They're not really asking. So that's why the funding piece of this is so key. And you have bodies like the Union of BC Indian Chiefs who have formally called on government to properly fund this process. And the funding needs to be twofold. There needs to be immediate upfront funding to essentially replace revenue from these agreements, right? If a nation has an agreement to gain revenue from logging on their territory, if government is just saying, hey, what about deferring logging in this valley? They have to also say, and we'll replace, you know, any revenue that you would lose we'll replace it to fund this conversation, to fund this process, right? That needs to be there, and we've seen no indication of that. And that's what we should be pushing with MLAs, is that, you know, there is a lot of, especially in more remote parts of the province, there is a lot of dependence on the status quo, you know, at the community level, municipal governments, companies, and government needs to be willing to step up and disrupt that and say, look, you know, we understand that immediate deferrals, which are required to ensure that the biodiversity is protected in the first place, we're going to fund, provide some bridge funding in the meantime to support that process. So that's the huge call, is that, you know, Indigenous rights are paramount. They, you know, the right of what happens, those nations do on the territory, those nations do hold that. But government has to engage in good faith, and they have to be just as responsive to nations like the Kwagilth on the north end of Vancouver Island, and others on the Tlaiamin, on the Sunshine Coast, to stop old growth logging. You know, Grand Chief Stuart Phillips said it himself. He said, you know, let's talk, let's engage, but let's put the chainsaws down first. And you know, that's a really good eloquent, as always, from the Grand Chief. So yeah, Marianne, thank you and your group so much for all your work, and thanks for the question today. I hope it was helpful, and we can connect more on that moving forward if you like. I see lots of other questions, so back to you, Chloe.
Okay, yeah, Mike has two questions. One, wondering about the experience of meetings so far and about having more than one person engaging in the meeting. And the other question is, why do they call it productive old growth? What does that mean?
Yeah, I'll answer that one first, actually. It kind of feels weird to use that term. You know, it feels linked to kind of commerce and industry and sort of the extractive values of forests, which are, of course, only one, and kind of the one that's been prioritized for decades. And that's what the whole problem stems from. Productive, it just refers to kind of the growth rate, right? The same thing that makes forests valuable to logging companies is, it is a bit like industry speak, but it's also widely used in the biological, like in the biology community and by scientists. It refers to the productivity of the forest in terms of the rate of growth, right? So there are forests that have never been logged that are technically old growth. You know, I'm thinking just below the tree line in Strathcona Park, and they have some value. There's rare species, their importance, but the rate of growth is such that, you know, you can have a 500-year-old tree that's this wide, and you know, 1,000 feet lower or closer to the coast, you can have a 500-year-old tree that's wider than this room, right? There's more biodiversity, there's more biodensity. And the reason why it's important to quantify is because government and industry benefit from the kind of flattening of old growth. So in terms of all forests in BC, the amount that's never been logged is just under 13 million hectares. So that's about 20% of all forest in BC is technically old growth. The problem is that very little of that is what's called high productivity. So the forests with the biggest trees, the most biodiversity. And so the importance of kind of highlighting this is that lots of the so-called lower productivity forests is never going to be logged anyway. Because it's too expensive to get to, and it's not valuable enough from an economic perspective. And so government can just say, oh, you know, there's that much old growth protected, we're never going to run out, when in reality, the kind of old growth that we picture when we close our eyes and think about it is that's what's being logged, that's what's rare, and that's what we're at real risk of running out of. The second question was around current experiences. So we've heard we heard a little bit from Marianne. We've heard from lots of other people that the meetings have been mixed, right? There are some MLAs that you know, have you know, were really kind of vocal about the old growth review process. You know, shared the panel reports. Nikki Sharma was mentioned. Bowen Ma was mentioned by Marianne, and you know, we're hearing genuine interests around this, right? What is currently happening? How does what government is saying differ from what's happening on the ground? What action is needed? You know, how can we solve issues like concerns around jobs and rural economies? How can we make sure that this is all being done with respect to Indigenous rights? There is that genuine interest. And then there's a little more defensiveness on other parts. So I've actually been asked to sit in on a couple meetings. You know, people have asked me to be a part of their delegation as someone who gets out in the woods all the time and works for an organization that works on this full time. And, you know, some MLAs are, hey, look, you know, I love old growth. Our government's doing more. You know, all the problems stem from the 16 years of liberal government. You know, we know you want us to go faster, but we can't for these reasons. So it really is a mixed bag. No constituents that we know of have met with the premier, for example, on this. But I imagine he would be pretty prickly and pretty defensive of his government's record on this. So it really is a mixed bag in terms of experiences. And you know, some people we've heard of have just, you know, sent one email and got a meeting with their MLA, and then others have had to really fight and kind of advocate for it, and others have been, you know, really pushed back on altogether, and their status is still kind of pending. Again, that's still taking up the MLA's time and their staff's time, and still, yeah, pushing this issue forward in terms of their awareness. So yeah, that's a little bit of what we've heard about from folks who've got these meetings so far.
The next question is from Cecilia, who asks if we do manage to meet, how to follow up afterwards.
This is a great question. MLAs have an uncanny ability to be really like enthusiastic and supportive and, oh yeah, this is great. Like, I'm really glad we met with you and thank you for bringing this to my attention. And, you know, and then, you know, by lunchtime, they've forgotten all about the meetings or any commitments they made. That's where, you know, compiling some resources, it would be great to, you know, when you're compiling some research or some things that you're going to cite, be it you know, the mapping project that I mentioned earlier, or the like a Wilderness Committee report, or a scientific report, or a news article, or a UBCIC statement, to have that on hand, mention it in the meeting, and then right after the meeting to follow up. You could ask them to report back to you. You could say, look, you know, it's May 17th. We're meeting today. You know, I've passed this information along to you. I want to hear about your progress. Can we meet on June 17th or something like that? So there is that method. So I would either, you know, on the meeting, try to set up a follow-up meeting or ask them to report back to you, or follow up by email shortly after and say, hey, you know, these are the studies that I referenced, and pieces like that.
We had a couple people asking about delegations, or rather like saying that they were interested in making delegations. So I just wanted to offer, as some folks already have, that you're welcome to share your contact information with each other on here, or connect afterward on social media or something. Of course, if that's mutually agreeable to everyone. And then my email, I'll put it in the chat. You can ask me, and I will keep my ear to the ground and see if I can connect you with anyone else. I know Torrance and Emily are pretty busy these days with their campaign work on protecting old growth forest, but I myself am available to support some delegation networking if you want me to. So
yeah, it's an important piece, both for the it bumps up the likelihood of getting a meeting. You know, some MLAs, you know, they're going to want to avoid this meeting if they can, but it's harder for them to say no, say, to 5 constituents than 1. And also, it can be easier, right? Meeting with an MLA or any decision maker can be a bit intimidating. So if you're going with 2 or 3 neighbors, that can be a route to make it easier.
We mentioned that on the tool we made, and it's going to take your MLA a little bit of time to get back to you. So I'm the type of person who likes to volunteer my friends. So I would like throw down a couple other names in my meeting request and then use the time that the meeting is getting scheduled to ask my friends to join me with that as another tactic.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Or say like me and several of my neighbors would like to meet, and then you could find the neighbors later.
Right. Yeah. Okay, Jay Wagner asks, do you have specific information on which First Nations are affected by old growth logging and the status of deferral conversations with government?
I mean, I would say every nation that has old growth in their territory, which is almost all. In BC, there's 203 officially recognized nations in BC, and I would say all of them have forests of some kind in their territory, and the amount of that's old growth is going to range, you know, from lower in heavily developed areas to higher in more kind of rural or lowly populated areas. In terms of deferrals, like they announced the first round of deferrals in September, and they've said that a second round is coming. They've been really, government has been really touch and go on where those are, how extensive they are, and when they might be announced. And then again, you know, a huge component of that is that they are working to get agreement from nations on that. And we're not privy to those conversations. So no, you know, we're in the dark in terms of what's coming, in terms of immediate action and next step. That's why we're encouraging the pressure to be put on. We do know of examples where nations have, you know, issued a call for old growth logging in their territory to end or be deferred, and haven't heard back from government. So that's an extremely concerning piece. And again, you know, we need to make it clear to government that if they're going to say, look, this nation has said they want old growth logging to continue as a valid reason to not defer old growth logging, then they need to be jumping to respond to the nations that have expressed an interest to protect old growth as well. So in terms of where things are at, we don't know much more than you at this point, but that could change. That could change anytime.
Marion, I saw your question in the chat, but your hand's up. Do you want to just ask on
I actually
video?
have two questions, yeah. So one of them is what's the role of the old growth review panel that did the report? I heard that Conroy is still working with them, and I'm wondering to what extent are they, can they be a powerful ally, or are they, who knows what they had to sign, what they waved away by doing this report? That's yeah, that's a big question. What about the old growth panel?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we met with the panel, you know, they struck me as honest guys who recognized the appetite for change. You know, they knew this wasn't a new issue. They knew that change was a long time coming. They said they didn't want to put out something that would be seen as too hard for government to accomplish. You know, they didn't say too radical, but that was kind of the connotations. And it's frustrating because continuing to log old growth, given its scarcity, given the impacts of that scarcity, is radical, right? So not doing anything is the most kind of radical option there is. Since then, they have been fairly critical. Ourselves and other organizations put out a report card on March 11th grading how government is doing on this, and the grades were bad. They got 1 D and 4 Fs in the subjects that we marked. And media contacted the one of the panelists, and he said, yeah, government's not moving fast enough. So in terms of that, I mean, the harder they come out and criticize government, essentially the easier it might be for government to distance themselves from them. You know, they want to maintain their impartiality and their independence. But that said, they wrote this report. They believe in their work, and if government's not doing enough to honor it. So, you know, I guess it's up to them to make that judgment. They have come right out and said, yeah, you know, we understand the frustration of the public, and we don't think government has moved far enough, fast enough. In terms of their engagement with the minister or the more likely ministry staff, I know that the ministry, you know, has been in touch with them, you know, probably seeking guidance and, you know, hey, recommendation number 6, what's the best way for us to go about that? At the end of the day, though, it's not their call. They're not in government. They were contracted to do this report, and it's the cabinet's call, which is where the problem lies. So, I mean, if they came right out and said, "Hey, government is totally failing the spirit of this report," that would be a big message, a powerful message for them to send. In terms of putting pressure on them, because they're not the decision makers, that's why we're looking to focus on the government, who is.
So one more final question, if I may, if no other questions have come in, is like, so what are the asks you want us to put out? So we're currently preparing for a meeting. With saying the ask is to meet with Horgan, because yeah, we can ask an MLA make the logging stop, but they're not in that power. So would that be the ask, or is that what is the short?
Their ask is to go to caucus or the cabinet. You know, depending on who the MLA is, they're all in government in caucus. Some of them will be in cabinet, but it's to go to them and say, look, you know, the panel called the current status quo unsustainable. They called for a paradigm shift. We know that the most important forests are what are disappearing fastest. Get up to speed on the latest science, the latest independent science. One of the resources that we'll make available is the Viridian report, which is an independent report that came out the same time as the old growth panel report. And it essentially does what government has refused to do, which is, I talked about the flattening of old growth and just calling any unlogged forest and referring to it all as old growth. The Viridian report actually stratifies it properly and puts it in the proper context. And those same authors, their names are Rachel Holt, Dave Doust, and Karen Price, are, we understand, working on further work to that, to kind of highlight from an ecological, biological ecosystem perspective what the most endangered, you know, as defined by the panel, what the most at-risk old growth is. And that's what government needs to be prioritizing. So they need to immediately engage with the nations whose territories overlap with those most important areas. They need to be funding this process, and they need to be, if there are barriers for that nation or non-Indigenous community to agree to a deferral, they need to be addressing those, right? If it's a revenue sharing agreement that the community can't do without, government needs to be funding alternatives for that, right? If it's concern around access to forests, if it were to be deferred, government needs to be making sure there's clarity on the protection of hunting rights and all those different things. So, you know, the stop stratifying all, or stop flattening all old growth as important, because again, all of it is, a lot of it isn't as threatened because it's not as valuable to industry. So identify that most at-risk old growth, and then immediately engage on a nation-to-nation basis with those nations and seek to defer logging in those areas as fast as possible. That's the asks for MLAs to then push uphill to their colleagues and to cabinet and to the premier. It is noon, but if there's a few more questions, we can go. I'm happy to go a bit over time.
Norman has a couple questions. I'm not sure I understand the first one, but I'll just read it. RCMP to enforce injunction today, but still can't find the May 5th WFP. I'm guessing that stands for Western Forest Products. Assault thugs.
Yeah. So there was altercation a couple weeks ago, and you know, on video assaults of some of the folks out at blockades by contractors with Western Forest Products, and you know, the RCMP has announced that they're investigating. The company's announced that they're investigating, and you know, as far as we know, nothing has come of that. And today, you know, related, the RCMP has moved to set up exclusion zones and announced that they'll start enforcing the injunction at other camps in the same area. So yeah, it's, I mean, injunctions themselves are tough. You know, they're a heavy-handed approach to, you know, what could be moved, what the RCMP could move on just under mischief charges, and they don't come with potential civil or criminal charges. So you know, the Wilderness Committee has long spoken out against injunctions generally. And yeah, but that's what we're learning. As to the RCMP's motives or priorities, I obviously can't comment on those because I don't know them.
Okay, Norman is also asking regarding Worthmore standing, are there any actual financial or economic studies to support this?
As of right now, because BC is so broad, I mean, yeah, that's something I think there's a few in the works. But I mean, anecdotally, like the tourism industry is gigantic, and you know, lots of, you know, the most kind of robust economies on rural Vancouver Island are places that haven't kind of put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. They're places that have diversified and maybe have a fishing or mariculture component or a tourism component, and you know, those things aren't incompatible with logging, but they're incompatible with there being not enough old growth in the area to support that tourism base. So that's a really good question, and kind of quantifying that. Of course, you know, I spoke just to, it's easy to kind of fall into sort of the trappings of economic language with this, you know, from an ecological standpoint, from a climate standpoint, right? The bigger trees can absorb and store more carbon, you know, and in a time when climate change is the biggest challenge our species faces, it makes more sense to leave these forests standing. You know, from Indigenous rights perspective, right? You know, a lot of cultural resources. A dugout canoe is a classic one. You can't make a dugout canoe out of a tree that's just this wide. You need big standing old growth or big blowdowns that only happen in old growth forests. But that's, you know, it's a good reminder to kind of frame the value of these forests standing. And then, you know, again, there's just the simple argument of what kind of future we want to leave, and do we want to be a jurisdiction that's removed most of the original forests and didn't transition to a forest industry based on forests that were planted by people when we should have.
I just put in a link to, I know the David Suzuki Foundation has done some research about that as well. Okay, John was asking, is there a way to find out what our MLA's stance on old growth logging is?
That's a good question. I mean, unless you live in Kootenay West, which is the forest minister's riding, or maybe the premier's riding, this can be hard information to get. A lot of MLAs kind of keep that close to their chest so that they can appeal to voters who both, you know, maybe work in the industry or want to see old growth logging continue, and so they can appeal to voters like us who want to see it protected. So, you know, I mean, there's a simple Google search is an option, you know, just your MLA's last name and then old growth. You might find some quotes from them. You could ask and have that as the request for your meeting. You know, I want to meet with you and hear where you personally stand on old growth. I know the government's position, but, you know, you could say, I know John Horgan's position. I know Forest Minister Conroy's position, but they're not my MLA. You are. You know, this is again an option for an opposition MLA too. You know, lots of the opposite, the Liberal Party, especially, you know, I think they kind of want to stand back on this as much as they can, so that they don't alienate the huge chunk of the public that wants protection. But yeah, those are the two suggestions that I have is search, you know, just search their name and old growth, or their name and conservation, or their name and climate change. And then, you know, if you can't find that information, include it in your query for a meeting. I'm just going to drop into the chat there. That's the Viridian report that I mentioned earlier, and that website is a great source of research and or source of resources and future research on old growth.
Okay, I think we're at the last question here, which professes to be a tiny bit off topic for the meetings, but is about the police enforcing the injunction at the blockades when an appeal has been filed. How can they obstruct access on Crown land?
Yeah, so the latter part of that is the fast part. So normally you can't, it's not illegal to obstruct access on Crown land, you know, without a pertinent, like if you went and blocked the intersection of Main and Broadway, the cops would move you pretty quick. But, you know, way out on a logging road that's technically Crown land, it's not illegal to block that. And that's why the company had to seek an injunction in the first place. As for the appeal, it's my understanding that if a judge issues an order, that's the law of the land until either the same judge or another judge counter that. So as far as I know, while the appeal is still outstanding, the injunction that was granted on April 1st that authorizes authorities, in this case the RCMP, to move blockaders, that stands. That's my understanding of it, but I'm not an expert on the legal side of things.
Well, thanks everyone for your really good questions and engagement here. What's this? Yeah, great. Maybe last call for anyone who wants to unmute and ask anything.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Good luck with your request. Thanks for all that you do on this. And you know, it can feel daunting and it can feel like an uphill battle, but you know, I've been at this a while. The Wilderness Committee has been at it for more than 40 years, and this definitely is a high momentum moment. You know, there are tons of people engaging in this. Our requests are going, I get CC'd on all these requests, and like there's lots every day. People are doing this, so you're not the only one, and collectively that is moving the needle, and let's keep that going. So thanks so much for being here, and we'll talk to you later. Have a good day.